Hello again. Keeping in theme with the Halloween movie list, today we're talking the Edgar Allan Poe movies from the 50s and 60s, all from American International Pictures. I think all of these were directed by Roger Corman. Vincent Price was in every single one of them except one. There were 8 films. I believe the one that he was not in had Ray Millard in the leading role. But all of them had this one theme. Oh, and one of them was not actually Edgar Allan Poe. It was a Lovecraft story, but they just marketed it as Edgar Allan Poe. And so they had what was called the Edgar Allan Poe Cycle of films. All of these endure to this day, all of them. And they're much like the Hammer films where they have this very specific allure to them. These are going to be the 8 Edgar Allan Poe movies from worst to best. If you're one of those people that fancies fables, fiction, film, tall tales, and high adventure, of course, again, here you are in the right place. Click like, click subscribe, even click notifications, and you'll get to see me again. So in the late 50s, early 60s, the Gothic horror films emerged in a way that were really enticing to moviegoers. You know, people were going to triple, double, features and whatnot, and seeing all of these, even with the Hammer films or some of the science fiction movies, but they really were drawing audiences in, and people loved them. And the studios, for example, they were just like, we can have somebody like Roger Corman make these with a shoestring budget, and if we have just the tiniest little modest box office take, it's a huge, huge win for us. So they loved the idea. They continued pumping these out, and they had a whole slew of different stories they could take from Edgar Allan Poe. Many of them, they were just taking the poem and turning it into a movie. A lot of times they were taking a very short story and turning it into a larger narrated story. But here we go. Here's number 8. Tales of Terror from 1962. The reason why this one is number 8 is because it's an anthology. Nothing wrong with it except for the fact that it's just, 3 disjointed stories, adapted from Edgar Allan Poe, but it's not one cohesive, film, of course. It's taken from the stories Morella, The Black Cat, and The Facts of the Case of M. Valdemar. Now, the appeal here, though, is that, of course, it's got Vincent Price in it. It also has Basil Rathbone. He's just so eloquent in the way he's portrayed on screen. Always a delight to see him in something, especially the Sherlock Holmeses, but he's great in this. And then, of course, the most important piece is that Vincent Price is paired with Peter Lorre. Peter Lorre, such a great character actor. And the two of them together, and this is going to come up later, but the two of them together, the bickering that goes on back and forth between them, it is such a beautiful dance that the two of them do. And I love when the two of them are together on screen.
What kind of a man are you anyway? Make love to my wife and doesn't even talk to me.
You're insane.
That may be, but very clever.
This did allow Roger Corman, and again, these are all directed by Roger Corman. This did allow Roger Corman to experiment a bit because they are 3 disjointed stories. This was inspired partly for AIP Films to do these what were called the teen drive-in films, or part of the drive-in culture. And by having an anthology like this, they could very easily put this in the drive-in, and teens would flock to it. Most specifically for the fact that they were moody, they were romantic, they had that macabre atmosphere to it, and so that appealed to this specific audience. Number 7 is The Tomb of Ligeia from 1964. This is the final entry in the Roger Corman's Poe Cycle, they call it. Ligeia blended this Gothic romance with supernatural horror. And it is the story of a man who's haunted by the spirit of his dead wife, who's played by Elizabeth Shepard, and she plays both the living and the ghost version of his wife. And this was the only, I'm pretty sure the only film, because it is marketed as these big studio set pieces for the most part. This is the one that is not. It does, partly, mostly, was filmed in a studio set. However, this is the only one that was also filmed on location in an English countryside. This one was not as financially successful as the other entries. I think they were kind of dialing down at this point. But it was admired for its haunting tone, and it did serve as a fitting end to the Poe cycle. Now, as I mentioned, Roger Corman did direct all 8 of these. This was in a very short time. So we're talking 8 films in a 5-year period from 1960 to 1964. And he shot these all on a very, very tight budget with a short schedule. And Roger Corman was the 101 and the epitome of low budget artistry. He brought in other directors that he was teaching. It was almost like the Leonardo da Vinci formula or assembly line of art that he had created, hundreds of years before this. He started to do this where he was bringing in new directors and teaching them how to do this. Number 6 is The Premature Burial from 1962. This is the only one that Vincent Price was absent, and he was replaced by Ray Milland in the lead role. And it's a man obsessed with being buried alive. This was a very common Poe theme that showed up over and over again. The concept of entombment while still being alive. It was part of his, he had this anxiety that did show up in his writing. And he, of course, he had this mysterious death where he was, found delirious in the streets of Baltimore. And then he died. I guess there's this mystery because he died uttering the name Reynolds, but was found, I believe, in the park or something like that. And theories range from like he was poisoned through alcohol, or he had contracted rabies, or there was some sort of political kidnapping. You run the gambit of all the different mystery conspiracy theories. They're all there. There was this underlying theme, and this also probably brought a lot of interest to his literature after his death because he died at such a young age. But death was this reoccurring theme on, and the anxiety and fears that revolve around that. Now, the reason that, there's probably multiple reasons that unknown to all of us of why Ray Milland was replacing Vincent Price at the time. But it was this experiment that they were doing, and they've been vocal about this, where they were trying to prove that the formula of these Poe films worked regardless of the pieces that you put into place. In this case, it didn't work, and they were proven wrong. Price's voice had become such an important, thematically, and like his theatrical presentation, as it were, gave this voice and melancholy gravitas that were, this part of the soul cycle that was missing from this one. Now, I tend to disagree. Even though I have Premature Burial as low as 6 on this list, I found this one to be somewhat enjoyable in the sense that it didn't have Vincent Price in it. That was, I actually, surprisingly, I'm not a huge Vincent Price fan, even though all the things that he's in, I happen to be a big fan of. He's, it's kind of like, I've said this about John Wayne. I was never a huge John Wayne fan, but oh my God, do I love John Ford movies. And boom, John Ford happens to use John Wayne in all those movies. So I kind of grew to love John Wayne. And the same goes for Vincent Price. I found him to be too theatrical at times. And Ray Milland added, a sense of realty to this one. So when you see the scenes of him acting in it, they're actually more believable scenes than had they been done by Vincent Price. And I appreciate that about this specific film. And I do like Ray Milland. I wouldn't say I love him or anything. He is what he is. But I appreciated the change that was done with this one. Even though it's not one of the best ones, it's still a good movie. I like it. Number 5 is The Haunted Palace from 1963. I was actually not aware that this was part of the Poe cycle until I started to kind of dig in and put this video together. And part of the reason for that is this was marketed as a Poe film at the time, but it actually wasn't really one of Poe's story. It's H.P. Lovecraft's from The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. American International Pictures just slapped Poe's name on it and then just used one of his titles from one of his stories and branded it as such because they felt like it just didn't matter. There was such interest in the macabre type literature at the time. And there was this reemergence at the time. I mean, in the early 60s, so much literature that was resurfacing at the time from sci-fi fantasy, so to speak. So the Robert E. Howard stories of Conan and such, those were getting reprinted. And there was a re-emergence of Tolkien at the time because they were reprinting those stories. And then Edgar Allan Poe, it led to that because he was the great horror writer of literature from the 19th century. And that was reemerging. And AIP took advantage of that wholeheartedly at this time. If you think about it, Edgar Allan Poe influenced Arthur Conan Doyle, and Stephen King has been notorious about citing Poe as being the father of American horror fiction. So clearly he was an influence on even Stephen King. Roger Corman felt that Poe was this 19th century existentialist. He believed Poe's stories weren't just like horror stories, but they were like these reflections of the human psyche. And he wanted to take advantage of that. And there was the psyche anticipating modern psychology well long before Freud had talked about it as well. And he called these films psychodramas during this time period. And I will add this, The Haunted Palace did have this feel that was way more similar to the Hammer films than it was to these Roger Corman Poe Cycle films. And that's part of why The Haunted Palace shows up as number 5 on this list over a couple of the others. Number 4 is The House of Usher from 1960. I believe this is the first of the films that they did. And this, of course, is based on The Fall of the House of Usher. And this is the Gothic horror that was the crumbling mansion and the cursed family lineage that was this vivid, colorful horror picture. The original story is really only a few pages long, but they expanded this as screenwriter Richard Matheson had put in like this full narration. And this has been adapted again and again, and each time they do this, it's expanded upon. Netflix has this really great series all about the fall of the House of Usher, and they really expanded on some of the subplots and each of the characters within it, which is so interesting because it's really just a few pages from Edgar Allan Poe, and look at all he's inspired, and look at everything that's like been developed past what he had put down as this foundation. And in this, Vincent Price plays the role of Roderick Usher, and he sets the tone for the entire series to come, because, again, this is the first film in the series. Big box office hit, so that's why AIP kind of rolled with this. And it did set the stage for these lush Gothic horrors that were like, it dominated the era, and kind of took... It was almost in contrast to some of the sci-fi and horror monster movies that they were doing separately. This was very different than that. And Roger Corman wanted to create this cycle that was really all about like very colorful, lush sets. And we're talking big sets, huge, romantic, Baroque, dark, atmospheric type. And of course, Vincent Price fit right into that perfectly for him. So that's why they were really a great couple to do this with. Vincent Price was notorious. He'd actually, because he was such a big Edgar Allan Poe fan, he ad-libbed a lot of his lines in the script, but he would insert Edgar Allan Poe lines that he was reciting verbatim into the films. And some people recognized it, some people didn't, but it was, it added just this really great flavor to it. There's plenty of outtakes that include that they didn't use. And if you will recognize, and this is one of the things I was complaining about, but it really shouldn't be a complaint, is Vincent Price's acting style did somewhat mirror Poe's poetic language because of his theatrics in just the linguistics in the way he spoke. It had this rhythm to it. It was a theatrical delivery. I sometimes felt it was overacting, but really it was succinct. It was spot on for what he was trying to do. And it was intentional, and he was mimicking this meter that was in tone with Poe's verse, especially with when we get to the Raven, we'll talk about that. But it was so often reflected of the poetry of Edgar Allan Poe. Interestingly enough, too, Vincent Price's birthday was the same birthday as Edgar Allan Poe. which is January 19th. Edgar Allan Poe was born in 1809, and Vincent Price was born in 1911. So there you have it. Number 3 is The Pit and the Pendulum from 1961. I think a lot of people put this one at number 1. I actually would have had this lower, but in preparation for this, I watched that film again, and I actually felt it was pretty good. I almost want to have it 1 or 2 because it is such a cohesive story. It's so tight with the way it's, and it also like, I remember I got 20 minutes into it, and I'm like, yeah, well, this ain't that great. And then it just developed. The turn of events in the film, especially right near the end, are very thematic. And I did change my tune on The Pit and the Pendulum. I found this one did lack the atmosphere of the other ones until you get to the end. And I also felt this was Vincent Price's worst acting of them. And he's fantastic in it. It's just, I felt some of the other ones are really over the top. Now, this one is a perfect example of the huge sound stages that Corman would film these on, with the exception of Legia. These were all filmed, like that one, part of it was on location. But this one, like, all huge sets. And then, he reused these sets over and over again. That's why he was able to make 8 movies in less than 5 years on these very, very slim budgets. And this one is a great example of just kind of the psyche that was used, or the psychology that both Roger Corman and Edgar Allan Poe loved about the stories. Many of them, there's guilt, there's obsession, there's just this madness that some of them go on. It's not really ghosts and monsters, it's just the unseen supernatural that makes them ideal for this, mid-century psychological thrillers that they have. And these, by the way, go back a little further as far as the time periods when compared to like the Hammer horror films and some of the other sci-fis, where like these take place almost in medieval times versus like some of the Hammer films take place at like the Victorian age. And with that said too, so the music, a lot of them were done by Les Baxter. He did do The Pit and the Pendulum. And his musical scores had this modern Gothic symphony to them. If you listen to the composed music from movies in the 60s, always had like this jazz motif to it. This one has like a jazzy, surreal orchestration to it that brought Poe's dread into the 1960s. It appealed to that beatnik culture with a Baroque flavor to it, giving these films like this haunted, it gave the film these haunted cocktail lounge vibe to it, which is so cool if you think about it. So Les Baxter was a big contributor to the atmosphere of these. Number 2, it is The Raven from 1963. This one is the most unique out of it, but this is the one, had I done this list back 20 years ago, The Raven would have been number 1. I was always wildly entertained by The Raven. This is the only one that's really a comedy. And the thing is, it's based on, a very short poem, and so it's basically by name only. So like if you see the very beginning of the movie, it recites the poem of the Raven. It takes them, 40 seconds to recite the poem, bam. And then they go into a completely made up story that really doesn't have anything to do with the poem, so to speak. And so rather it be this grim meditation on death, the film became really just a horror comedy, and it involves sorcery and these 2 rival magicians, and there's tons of camp, but it's just the right amount of camp. It really felt almost like one of those episodes of like Bewitched or I Dream of Jeannie or with like this tone of like the Batman and Robin series or some of these sci-fi shows. It had just the right flavor to it that I loved. And so again, now you have Vincent Price and Peter Lorre bickering. So the comedy right there is just explosive. And then you have probably one of the most important people to monster horror in Boris Karloff. I got to tell you, as much as I love Vincent Price and Peter Lorre's back and forth, Boris Karloff in this is so great. And I remember as a kid, I gravitated towards it because I was like, hey, that's the voice of the guy that does the Grinch cartoon. You know, all the little who's down in Whoville. That guy. Loved Christmas movies as a kid, and that was who I recognized in this. Man, can that guy, spin a spell. It's just so great to have him. And when Jack Nicholson is in this, very low key. He's just this kind of, upbeat young character that shows up. Roger Corman reused this set not only for the other Poe Cycle films, but he also used it for this other movie called The Terror, because I believe Boris Karloff had in his contract another film they had to do. So I think as a favor to him, he kind of like, let's just bang this out. We'll just use the same set. And they used Jack Nicholson was the star of it, but they used Boris Karloff in it. And so they filmed it kind of simultaneously. I think they filmed it like almost over a weekend or two, which is, if you've seen The Terror, it's not that great of a movie. So you can see they were cutting corners there big time. Now, The Raven, the poem, that's the piece of literature that made Edgar Allan Poe famous. It didn't make him rich, but it made him famous. I believe he earned $9 for the poem, but it's what made him a household name. And then finally, my number one, if you've seen any of my other videos that have lists, like my top 100 films, you'll know what this is because this shows up on that. It is The Mask of Red Death from 1964. It was one of the later, it wasn't the last film on the list, but Roger Corman was firing on all cylinders. This I believe is Roger Corman's greatest film of all times. That's why it's on my top 100. And of the films in the cycle, this one is the most faithful to Poe. It captured this really grim, it's like an allegory of death as this unstoppable equalizer that's just coming for you no matter what you do. And Corman did kind of take this from a bit of Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal. The imagery and the cinematography is very similar with the death character versus in The Mask of Red Death, they have the Black Plague that is coming for people. And this one, even more specifically than the other Poe movies, is the most colorful. The use of color is themed throughout, and so they have a use for each color throughout.
Somewhere in the human mind, my dear Francesca, is the key to our existence. My ancestors tried to find it. To open the door that separates us from our Creator.
And I also believe this to be one of Vincent Price's best. I've always said that his best film was The Witchfinder General, which, by the way, was done by a separate production company, but AIP bought that film. And this is the Michael Reeves film that, came out in the early 70s. They bought that film. They changed the name to The Conqueror Worm, which was an Edgar Allan Poe story. It has absolutely nothing to do with Edgar Allan Poe. So they just slapped that name on it. This is after the Edgar Allan Poe cycle of films. They now have one more film, and they marketed it as if it were an Edgar Allan Poe film when it was released in America, even though the movie was called The Witchfinder General. In America, it was called The Conqueror Worm. But so I got off track there, going back to Mask of Red Death. It tells the story. Vincent Price is, as I said, one of his greatest roles. He has this really great performance as Prince Prospero. And if you've seen my greatest villains list, Prince Prospero is on that list. He's this sadistic nobleman who's trying to outwit the plague by holding himself up in his big castle, and the aristocrats and all of the noblemen, the rich people that live in the village get to stay there with him, but he's kind of holding it over their head, and he makes them do these just outlandish things, and he just treats them like children, or he literally treats them like crap. He plays jokes and pranks on them. But this one was praised as the most beautiful horror Gothic image-wise, of the decade. And Roger Corman kind of got, I think his name was already on the map, but this one elevated him a bit. He did do Little Shop of Horrors, which was a huge hit for him. And, that went in all the directions that we're all familiar with, of course. This one really did put him on the map as far as somebody that could put together an excellent piece of film. And like I said, I mean, Corman flooded this with lush color and symbolizing madness in Prince Prospero and all the characters around him. And then just the moral decay of society around him as this plague is gaining real estate around them and taking everybody's lives. But there you go. There are my Edgar Allan Poe films ranked from worst to best. And as Poe might whisper from the shadows himself, the tale is told, but the dark still remains. The films may end, but like Poe's words, the shadows linger, like the next dreamer to wander into the dark. I want to thank you for watching all the way to the end. I'm Foxy Cellars. If you would, click the like, click subscribe. You're going to get notified of more of these types of film videos and storytelling that I'm going to produce in the future. Thanks again for watching.